A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the high-level launch of the Civil Society Diagnostic Report on Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, with the economic crisis hitting Sri Lanka, we had calls across the board, across Sri Lanka, for a system change. Initially, when the people came out and called for a system change, they were unsure of what this really meant. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part of the system change that Sri Lanka is speaking of. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not try to sugarcoat the realities of the day in Sri Lanka. We as a nation have failed. But despite that fact, that does not mean that Sri Lanka's journey as a great nation ends here just because of the fact that we failed. Ladies and gentlemen, as the saying goes, failures are the pillars of success. And it is up to us now to learn from these failures, to use these failures, and to build on these failures and make these failures our pillars of success. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, this governance diagnostic report was prepared by the Civil Society Initiative on Anti-Corruption Reform for Economic Recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, this is comprising of several civil society initiatives, and I believe that the Executive Director of TISL, Nadishani Pereira, will address you on that fact when she delivers the opening address, and I cordially invite now onto the stage the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka, Attorney at Law, Nadishani Pereira, to deliver the welcome address.
A very good morning to you all. Dear distinguished members of civil society, our colleagues, including representatives from civil society organizations, experts, professionals, academics, also our distinguished members of parliament and distinguished members of representing the diplomatic community, international financial institutions, our donors, and friends. First of all, thank you very much for coming here today, being a weekday and a morning. I'm sure you had many other engagements, but you have accepted our invitation and given your time to be with us today, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. We want a system change. We want a future for us, for our children. We want accountable governance. We want to see transparency. We want to see recovery of stolen assets. We want a corruption-free Sri Lanka. These slogans, do they resonate with you? Like Shalan mentioned, they were very loud and popular last year when our youth led an unprecedented, peaceful people's uprising, a protest for over 3 months. And in fact, giving an example around the world, persevering until they wanted some level of accountability from the leadership at that point. And one thing remained though. This came after within an economic crisis. And I don't need to explain to you what the economic crisis was about, but it felt like we all know. But what was the unique thing about this crisis and these people's uprising? Probably for the first time, that Sri Lankans from all walks of life connected high level governance and their bread and butter. High level governance and their ability to live their day to day life. Governance and economy. That's why when the economic crash, when we hit bankruptcy, and there were issues in the world like the war in Ukraine, or we were just coming after a pandemic, but people knew yet many countries face this, but we would not have hit bankruptcy if we had our governance in order. People understood there was a crisis. People understood that we have those to whom we have entrusted the stewardship of our nation, our public resources to take decisions on our behalf for our future generations have not done that job. So that call is still there. People are unable to protest in the same way now. And much has happened since then. And certain steps with the support from the International Monetary Fund and other bilateral donors and financial institutions such as the World Bank and the ADB, the nation is slowly running again. However, there is a question. Is this economic recovery? Have we addressed the root causes of the crisis that led to the economic recovery? If we don't address these root causes, it may look like the problem is sorted, but it can erupt again. It's like you put a plaster on a wound. It looks good, right? But if you don't really put the medicine needed, the wound will go under and it will become worse. And it will come up again one day. And this is the issue that this today we are trying to deal with. Civil society organizations along with TISL, you can see the logos here. What we realized was that right now, at this point, is a unique moment in Sri Lanka where our actions of our rulers, actions of citizens, of civil society will determine whether we recover as a nation or not, whether we'll use this opportunity, this difficult situation to actually learn our lessons and make a change, a lasting change that will change the direction of Mother Sri Lanka for our children, at least. Right. And then we realized that there was a gap in terms of really identifying and articulating what this system change needs to be. There is a technical aspect in that. People understood that people see corruption in their day-to-day life, but people understood that this is also corruption at a very grand high level. This is about the systems, whether the accountability structure is working, whether separation of powers is working, and how these things all became macro-critical we saw last year. And hence, it was important to identify in an evidence-based way, what are the problems, and then with the input from the people, identify possible solutions. And we need to start immediately, then short term, medium term, long term. It's a long journey, but this is a moment to get going. Otherwise, it may seem like we are managing, but we may not be addressing any of the governance issues that led to the crisis. Therefore, a group of us just thought, it's not that we did not have our usual work going on in our organization, but we thought this is a moment for our country that we need to do this. We need to use our expertise and also our stakeholders that we work with, everybody's input together, get everybody on board and come up, identify the problems and the solutions, and then, give that guidance to the government and the development partners as they try to steer the economy in the right direction. Hence, we came up with this civil society initiative for anti-corruption reform for economic recovery. I know it's a long name, but this connection is so important. We need anti-corruption reform for economic recovery without addressing the corruption problem. And corruption means the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. Without addressing that, we can't address the crisis. So we then came together, and hence we then, of course, we commissioned this to an experienced consultant, Professor Arjun Parakrama, and of course, considering the speed at which the political decisions are being made, it had to be, in a sense, rushed. I mean, this kind of study, we could have done it for a year even, right? And consulted more and more people, but it had to come at the right time as well. And we are not saying that this is perfect, however, it gives you a very important, valuable guidance. It sheds light to some critical governance, anti-corruption reform that are essential to ensure that this money that is being injected to our nation through the IMF and other development partners will not get re-corrupted, but will be used in the proper way to uplift the country and to bring equitable and sustainable economic recovery. So I welcome all of you, and to give your full attention as we take you through the contents, the findings, and the recommendations. And thereafter, in your respective capacities, please be champions for this change. We need all the support we can get to push for this change, and let's do it for our country. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Nadishani Pereira, Executive Director of Transparency International, Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already don't know, the organizations, the civil organizations that banded together and thought it fit to formulate this context-driven, domestically steered, and independent of the government diagnostic on, the governance failure here in Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, the civil societies that were involved in preparing this governance diagnostic report are PAFRL, the Center for Policy Alternative, Sarvodaya, Verite Research, and of course, the National Peace Council. Ladies and gentlemen, up next is the most important part of today's event. It is the reason why we are all here, the governance diagnostic report that is being released. And ladies and gentlemen, to present the findings on this governance diagnostic report, I cordially invite onto the stage Professor Arjuna Parakrama. He is a scholar and activist, and over the last 40 years, he has a distinguished academic career, including former visiting fellowships at the Columbia University, New York, the University of Pittsburgh, USA, La Trobe University in Australia, the US Institute of Peace, the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs, and the National University of Malaysia, as well as shorter teaching and research assignments in India and Nepal. He was a Fulbright New Century Scholar in 2007, 2008. He's also a global expert on human rights-based approach in development and on conflict transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, please accord a warm welcome, of course, to Professor Arjuna Parakrama, who will be presenting the findings on the governance diagnostic report.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. I'm going to present the findings, the conclusions, and the ways forward as we see it on the basis of this study that we have done. Without much ado, let me get to the report itself. So, first, the background and the context. As you know, this is the worst post independence economic crisis. We have intense hardships, unprecedented people's uprising, as have been pointed out. And the key public platforms on this which was based were fighting corruption and nepotism, demanding accountability. There has also been, it's sad to note, a shrinking civic space and a crisis of legitimacy. I will not go into the details, but I think that's fairly clear. We have also the signs, very clear signs, of impunity leading to state capture, which need to be addressed. May 2022, May 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history. And in March 2023, the IMF approved the 2.9 billion EFF for the 17th time. So we have lots of first and 17 times. The current IMF program includes governance and anti-corruption pillar for the first time in Asia. So this is also an opportunity for us to engage with this issue for the first time and be an example, a clear example, not only to Asia, but also across the board in IMF diagnostics. But I think the key issue is the last one here, that there is an overall perception that the initial reforms, as they have been done now, burden the poor, not the culprits. So the question is, there is an unequal responsibility borne by the people who are not responsible for the crisis, whereas those who are responsible are sort of remain relatively unscathed. So this is the methodology. We had extensive consultations across the country, 9 focus group discussions, 250 odd people, which were not first time meetings. They were meetings based on trust and understanding that was built up across the years with all the groups and the associations that the core group and others had. And this sort of ensured in some way a sectoral, geographical, ethnic, religious, and ideological, demographical thing. So we had people who represented different areas in the spectrum of ideology, economic, political, social, and so on. So then we had the overall guidance of the core group and a validation meeting with multiple revisions and teamwork. I want to underscore the fact that this is teamwork. All of us have put something into this, and we hope that ownership will become crucial. What is the type of report that we have produced? I think that's important to say at the outset. This is a strictly evidence-based report which balances research with public experiential insights and ownership. So it's something that's very carefully and meticulously documented. So it's not, this then needs to lead to advocacy. It needs to lead to, it's not a report that is in itself an advocacy document, but it should lead to that. It's very carefully researched, as I said, and documented, and everyone has contributed to that. It targets policy intervention and public interest advocacy. The methodology, as I've said, the types and sources of information. We have used 5 types of information. We use relevant national studies, reports, summaries, key informant interviews. This was the core and the heart of much of the work. And then the 9 focus group discussions across the country. If that's the heart, this was actually the body of it. The body of it being the responses that people gave us from all walks of life. Then we did regional comparative studies and analyses, related legislation and documents, and then we went to more journalistic and public-oriented pieces on the governance corruption nexus, because this has to be both private, both public, and intellectually solid. So we looked also at the relevant IMF documents, country reports in the region and elsewhere as relevant. So now let me identify some key concerns. And I apologize, it's a bit of a long slide because we had issues in terms of formatting. So first is the entrenched corruption and state capture has weakened the accountability framework. So we are not starting from ground zero, we're starting from a minus place that we have to build up. So there is the accountability framework, the state and private mass media is manipulated, civil society repressed, the misuse, we can say abuse of state-owned enterprises, interfere with public procurement and with public officials. So the question then that we ask is, how will reforms addressing these very issues fare without a system change, as has been pointed out? So it's a chicken and the egg thing. These are the things we want to change, the reports, and these are the very things that entrenches a regime and a system that is corrupt and abusive. So the question then that we have to ask is the government committed, or how committed is the government and its partners in this case for the planned reforms that we need to go well beyond the IMF agreement? I mean, this is important. We are writing a report at this stage, but it's not a 2-year or even a 4-year kind of horizon. This goes well beyond that. Is there the political will and the implementation mechanisms which should be instrumental, will not be instrumental, but be holistic? So we're not talking about one reform because it's dictated and another one there, while at the same time there are other counter reforms in the wings, as we said. While there are many long overdue and laudable laws which have been brought, we say perhaps at the IMF suggestion or at their nudging, many other draconian laws are still either in place, like the PTA, others are in the wings, such as the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act, the Broadcast Bill, the NGO Bill, and yet others are selectively misused, like the ICCPR Act, which is used only to target certain kinds of people. So that's the context we have. We should not go overboard with the fact that some good legislation is coming up, because this other stuff is always there. So as in the past, implementation, which should be impartial, efficient, economical, transparent, and accountable, it needs to be monitored and it needs to be made public. So let me now move to the proposals, having done the background. We devised 3 organizing principles for these governance benchmarks. These are the benchmarks. The first is the immediate, in the sense that measures that enhance the transparency and accountability of existing systems that are necessary to produce the required fiscal and governance outcomes. So that's clear. That's the here and the now, what's not been followed properly, what needs to be made more transparent, more accountable in the current. The second are measures to improve macro political economic stability and sustainability. And note, it's political economic, not merely economic, because the governance benchmarks that we have go beyond the narrowly economistic. And then the third is measures towards structural change. So the second one would be, if existing legislation is inadequate, these are the things that are required to bridge that gap. And the third will go furthest, and that is measures towards structural changes that are necessary to significantly reduce corruption, risk, and impunity. Those require changes. So those are the longer term. So maps clearly on the immediate being the first 6 months. That's the first category. The second would be up to 1 year, and we are using the IMF terms as well that they have used. And then the next is up to 2 years. So this now is a kind of organization, as it were, of how the recommendations. There are 34 recommendations, and this is how we have organized them and structured them. I know I will go through all of them in some respect, but I think it's important to get the overview, as we said, needs to be seen holistically, not to cherry pick 1, 2, or 3, because they seem to be appropriate and easy. So the first we have is an overarching and foundational recommendation, which is immediate. Then we have tax reform, revenue collection, and expenditure control, which are 13 recommendations, 9 of which are immediate, and 4 within 1 year, what we call medium term. Then procurement, 3 recommendations, 1 is immediate and 2 within 1 year. We have asset declaration, 1 which is immediate. Deterrence against corruption, including prosecution, 8 governance benchmarks. 3 are immediate, 2 within 1 year, and 2 within 2 years. Environmental protection, 1 which is immediate. Democratic legitimacy, establishing the mandate, which is lacking, as we said, we have a crisis of legitimacy. We have 4 recommendations, 2 immediate, 1 within 1 year, and 1 within 2 years. Reduction of unnecessary expense, one which is immediate, and social inclusion, the safety net, 2, 1 within 1 year, and 1 within 2 years. So that's the overview. Now, I know it may not be of great interest to all, but let me go through each of these so that we have some kind of understanding of what we are addressing and where we are. Right. So now let's look at the first set. That the first one is the overarching foundation, which we have put as recommendation 18, because it needs to come, it needs to be there to guide the others. But we are clear that some other recommendations need to be in place as well. So there, what we have is we need to protect and uphold civic space and fundamental rights. This is seen as a very high priority. I'll do an analysis later, but let's understand that. So then we move to the second set, which relates to tax reform, revenue collection, expenditure control. And in that, if we look at the tax exemptions, we have 6 recommendations there. I'll scroll down, but at the moment, so those expenditure, the tax exemptions, so the exemptions, first is to maintain a physical transparency platform that displays all information related to tax exemption. In many cases, we found that if there is information, it's hidden, it's inaccessible, it's deliberately disinforming, it's misleading, it's partial. So I think part of the heart of it, it's really hard, but there has to be political commitment, because that exposes the people who are responsible. So in many cases, you'll notice that we have asked for public access, not things that you have to go and apply and so on. So it will be public online access, which is clear and transparent. And so that where there is no gap between what is the law and its implementation. So this can be seen. So there we have 6 sub-recommendations about the transparency platform. And in terms of the longer term there, the up to 12 months, we're talking about we need to amend all tax exemptions. So you notice, so we have a list of the exemptions. Then when that's wrong, the next one is the policy change to address that. As you know, there are some exemptions which are birth to death. Some companies, some organizations have never been taxed and will not be taxed. Some of them are taxed unequally. Okay, so amend those things, because there is an excessive discretion. This is what leads to corruption. This is what corruption is. So we need to remove that. Then, for example, tobacco tax. We are very clear that there is a great loss of revenue there, and that needs to be sorted out immediately. Then we are looking at, and it's reasonable, an annual reduction of 10% in tax exemptions. So that we are not asking for it to be done overnight, but 10% needs to be done in the first 12 months to show the bona fides and the kind of the fact that there is that political will by the state. So we move from there. So those are only medium and long term. Yeah. So then we look at the next stage, which relates to expenditure. We have 4. Excuse me. We have 3 immediate demands there. Publishing the annual report, setting out expenditure variation against approved budget. This, I think, is very important. Expenditure variation. People will say that you can get it at the budget and so on, but expenditure varies so that people know what is budgeted and what has been spent, and that has to be transparent and accountable. I think the key thing is that the systems need to be placed, they need to be accessible by the people, non-economists like me and others. So then the quarterly expenditure reports, limiting the budget allocation under development activities of the Department of National Budget to 3% of total expenditure. So expenditure controls need to be very clear, and they need to be accountable. So we look at then the next one, the question of audit and debt. So there we have more immediate ones and one longer term. I think the longer term one, yes. So there we have the Auditor General's report, follow-up action. The reports are there and they become just observed in the breach. So we require follow-up action to be regularized, to be clear. Then the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which I think is very important. It's an old act, but it's observed in the breach entirely, and there are 3 sub-recommendations on that. Then, of course, compliance with the Right to Information Act and the publishing of quarterly information on public debt. These need to be transparent and accountable. They can't be secrets in government. I think important thing that we have done for the medium term is to set up the recommendation to set up a public debt management office external to the central bank. I think this is crucial because that is where you can't have a whole set of conflicts of interest aside from politicization involved in a place that needs to be impartial. And we are discussing a separate section on conflict of interest. So I think it's important to see that. Yes. Then we come to the very vexed question, which is very public and very clear about the domestic debt reconstruction, not optimization, and its relation to the EPF. So we think that there are 3 recommendations there in terms of the conflict of interest involved, in terms of a sort of very sort of unique and interesting application of the pari passu principle as regards domestic debt in terms of seeing equality across the board, and to sort of identify the secondary market transactions, the EPF, across the board. When you say the country has lost money in various scams, it's the EPF that has lost, which means the ordinary people have lost that money. So I think that sums up our list in terms of the tax reform, revenue collection, expenditure. And now we move to another really crucial issue, procurement. There we have 3 recommendations, 1 immediate and 2 medium term. We need to have a public, you notice the emphasis over and over again is public accessible platform that identifies all significant public procurement contracts which are over 100 million rupees. So I think that needs to be necessary. It needs to be public. Then we need to strengthen the National Procurement Commission on the medium term, particularly in terms of its oversight on unsolicited proposals. So you have to pass those, because we know that's where most of the corruption takes place, that in the unsolicited and emergency area. Right. Then we are saying, this is not too harsh, we're saying we need at least 10 audits of 10 state ministries where competitive bidding is over 10 billion in terms of procurement. So that there is a progressive kind of thing. We are hoping to make the systems clearer. That's where you move to a system change. Not immediately, but you move towards that. Right. Then asset declarations. We are saying that the Anti-Corruption Act needs to be implemented in that case, because asset declarations, as you know, are there, but they are secret and they can't be, there's an entire story around that which needs to be sorted out. Now we move to a new category, which is deterrence against corruption, including prosecution. There are 8 proposals in all, 3 which are immediate, 3 which are short term, and 2 which are longer term. So we need to reduce corruption and waste in relation to benefits of political leaders. In fact, the one sub-recommendation we have there is a very simple thing, but none is about the use of vehicles, use and abuse of vehicles, and how they stand in terms of that. We are saying publish that. Right? We don't know how many and so on and all of that. So that then we're looking at politicization of the public service. This is indeed a tragedy, and we need to be able to see measures in revoking that. And then we also have CEOBOC, and we are talking about, there's a very detailed recommendation on CEOBOC's readiness to investigate. What does it investigate? How does it investigate it? And so on. Then in terms of the short term, up to 12 months, we have a conflict of interest register. I think this is very important, and this is a good example best practice elsewhere. And there are 3 sub-recommendations there. This conflict of interest does not seem to be a concept that we are either familiar or comfortable with in this country. So I think we need to be able to bring that onto the table. Then we have the management of the state enterprises. These seem to be at the moment like the public, the sort of the public property or the private property of certain public people. So that I think needs to be sorted out. Then we talk about the illicit financial flows. These are very important, and we need to see the IFFs. We need to see control of that. Then, of course, in the longer term, in the 24-month horizon, we are talking about the asset recovery. It's a stolen asset recovery. This is crucial. And then we're talking about an independent public prosecutor's office. This has been a very long demand. As you know, the Attorney General's Department functions as an organ of the government, not even the state. And that becomes extremely problematic, and we are asking for that. So then the next one is very clear: environmental protection. We need again that to be public and aware. We don't know where it is and where it happens, and so on. Then we move to the question of democratic legitimacy. This is a key issue for any reforms to be owned and understood and practiced. And there we are saying in the immediate term, elections must be held. That's the first point. Elections must be held, and there are two sub-recommendations on that. And we also need that the election campaign expenditure need to be monitored. In terms of the second subsection on this elections, we're saying the election commission needs to be financially independent. So that can ensure. Then we are saying fairly simple. So we have mixed, simple, straightforward things, but nonetheless important ones. The medium term is parliamentary standing orders to better reflect continuity and accountability. Every time there's a prorogation, then all the committees get dissolved, and then it's a way of disturbing and manipulating the business of parliament. Then 34, which is our so the last recommendation, we talk about the Constitutional Council. This is a longer term thing. Needs to be more reflective of society, civil society, needs to be more public, and it needs to be more engaged in other work. Right now, it is still in the capture of the political class. So an unnecessary device of expenditure, this I think, aside from its political and social importance, we are presenting this as also an economic issue. The sort of demilitarization, particularly of the North and the East, and the cutting of the military expenditure. I think this is crucial, and we have explained that. So because it is, and I will discuss that later, it is clearly a political issue. It's an issue of ethics and morality, but we are presenting it here because the IMF will say perhaps that they are only their mandate is only in terms of economic. So we are suggesting the other governance issues in this economic waste. So we move then to the final section. In many ways, the hardest and the most publicly spoken about, the social inclusion, safety net, and protection of the most vulnerable. I think this is something that we have had a relatively proud history in the past of protecting those who are vulnerable. So we'd go through a 30-year war and still not have the kind of levels of poverty and starvation that we have now. And I think that's an extremely sad and terrible predicament. So we are suggesting in the medium term that the new, the new safety net cash transfer thing needs to be more transparent, more accountable, more open, and I think we need to rethink that. The cash, while we agree that multidimensional poverty is much more important and correct and accurate than mere financial things, we believe that aspects of that, like illness and debility and so on, needs to be universal. The coverage for that needs to be universal. If somebody has chronic kidney disease or thalassemia or something, that coverage needs to be the targeting and the financial thing, yes, but that needs to be more accountable and transparent. Then, of course, we have the issue of the Malayalam Tamil population, and we are suggesting that both land and workers' rights need to be enshrined and need to be thought of in any serious engagement with the national policy. So basically now I'm going to analyze a bit, and thank you for your patience. I'm looking at, in terms of the public discussion that we had across the country, these are the highest public priority benchmarks. Right. The strong gender consensus for protecting civic space and fundamental rights. That's our 8th proposal. That is very clear, very strongly felt, and universal across the board. From Jaffna to Matara and everywhere in between where we went, this is clear. The second is the holding of national elections in time. This is not in any particular order. The national election time, this is number 4 too. That was also very clear across the board, even in areas traditionally who are quite disparaging of elections. They still feel that that is very important, that legitimacy is important. Then the third, safeguarding the EPF and other superannuation funds, including from targeted domestic debt reconstruction. I think that is also very clear and felt across the board in the plantation areas, in Ampara and so on, wherever we went to discuss it. Then the fourth is reducing corruption and waste in benefits to politicians and bureaucrats. Felt the disparities, felt how people suffer, and they see people traveling in 5 and 6 cars, and we don't know where they are, and people don't give it back, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's extremely important. So if we continue, right, we also say establish an independent corruption prosecution office. A public prosecution office, I think, is also seen right across the board, because they see the Attorney General's department as a lackey of the government and not as something independent. So therefore, it's extremely difficult, coupled with the other scandals that we've had. Increasing transparency of new social safety net, again seen as crucial. And of course, last but clearly not least, the expediting of stolen asset recovery. This needs to be fundamental. Now, if you look at the specific groups, not only them, but by and large, these are non-negotiable sort of game-changing principles would be the demilitarization of North and the East, reduction of military expenditure that you can clearly see comes from North and East and other areas. So it's not only there, but it is basically, as they say, if we think you are legitimate, if you think you're bona fide, if you think that you are serious, then this is something you need to do, because you've not done it. Of course, the housing and livelihood protection for Malaya Tamil community. So that's, I think, the set of priorities from the public point of view, very strongly held, and an active citizenry which is no longer passively going to wait years and years and years and years till they get an election, if they do. So yes, now the question, the final thing, as we said, the devil in the detail or in the implementation. So assessment of results, accountability mechanisms. There's a universal comment across, both in the key informant interviews as well as in the focus group discussions and in the literature. Implementation of the recommendations must be independently monitored, progress must be measured, and accountability assessed. The monitoring and evaluation framework must be for each governance benchmark, not an overall thing. There must be a monitoring and evaluation framework for each government benchmark. The monitoring and evaluation of progress should involve the active and equal participation of appropriate civil society entities to ensure that targets are met and goals remain in sight. The actual mechanism needs to be discussed and need to be very careful, but I think these 3 principles are very clear. Without this, we will only have words on the page, we will have promises, or we'll have partially, selectively implemented good stuff and lots of bad stuff threatening us in the wings. So that's all I have to say, and I'm happy and privileged to be here. I think there will be space in more informal context for discussion of this, and I know the members of the group will also contribute. I hope I haven't gone over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Arjuna Parakrama. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears went into the compilation and the publication, of course, of this Civil Society Governance Diagnostic Report. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, there were several key civil organizations that were involved in the compilation of this Governance Diagnostic Report, and this is the opportunity to give them to speak a few words, of course, to everybody who are present here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now cordially invite one representative from each of these civil organizations on stage. they may come up on stage and take their seat, and they will be given an opportunity to address the gathering today. Up first, ladies and gentlemen, I take this opportunity to cordially invite onto the stage Dr. Vinya Aryaratna, the president of Sarvodaya. Another key contributor to the governance diagnostic report, Dr. Pakiasoti Sarvanamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. Dr. Nishan Dimel, Executive Director of Verite Research. Mr. Rohana Hettiarachi, Executive Director of Pafarel. And also Dr. Gehan Pereira, the Executive Director of the National Peace Council. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just being informed that the Executive Director of Pafarel had to step out for a moment, and in his stead, a representative of Pafarel will be addressing the gathering, ladies and gentlemen. So if we could begin the addresses with Dr. Vinya Aryaratna, President of Sarvodaya. Ladies and gentlemen, I also cordially invite onto the stage the Executive Director of Transparency International, Attorney at Law, Navishani Pereira.
Thank you. Good morning. Actually, I'll focus very briefly on the social protection and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me focus on the social protection, social safety net recommendation in our governance diagnostic report. I will first start by quoting from one of our FDG participants. Actually, we commend the approach of Aswasuma, which is the latest social protection mechanism that has been proposed and being implemented right now. It's very broad. It's a multi-dimensional approach to poverty in Sri Lanka, and a much better comprehensive assessment base for selecting the beneficiaries. So I quote from this FDG participant. I participated initially in collecting information from families in our village and surrounding areas. Now I can't even stay in my home because people are angry due to problems with how this information has been used to select Aswasuma recipients. Many of the young people who collected the information didn't even know or care what they were doing. And injustice has taken place. How can we solve this problem? Unquote. Here we have seen that local consultations have been used, and there is a fact that widespread dissatisfaction with the newest iteration of the social safety net, which is Aswasuma, and there's a high degree of confusion and lack of transparency. So while we welcome the multidimensional nature of the selection process, it is necessary to recognize that coverage should be universal for non-income related needs and conditions. And also, the open public debate is required, and it's key to raise awareness and garner support, the public buy-in, which is very important for a long-term social protection mechanism in the country. So if this is not feasible or necessary for such far-reach, it is not feasible or necessary for to force such far-reaching changes without evidence-based rational discussion on the pros and cons, and hence this is at the core of our governance landscape that we are talking here today, especially given the overall financial difficulties faced by all citizens of Sri Lanka. Now, continuing on this, we can really look at this as a core governance issue and also has serious implications on the financial restructuring that's taking place. So the IMF proposals seek to increase expenditure with improved coverage, but a recent study demonstrates that the key challenges of lack of transparency and also favoritism, discrimination on the basis of ethnicity, language, gender, occupation, mismanagement or corruption, as well as communication gaps remain inadequately addressed. Therefore, we have made this recommendation that we should increase transparency and accountability of the new social safety net cash transfers through reconceptualizing multidimensional poverty indicators. Recently, there has been a lot of interest, and we have seen a lot of updated information. There's data, disaggregated data by geography, socioeconomic groups. These can be used for a more inclusive and satisfactory program of social protection in Sri Lanka. And also, while providing universal access, we have to have universal access for families with disability, illness, and trauma. And then we have made two specific recommendations, one short term, one medium term, here to increase of course, the transparency and accountability of the new social safety mechanism. Then also very specific recommendation in the medium term, alienate land for user-owned housing in the Malayaha Tamil areas, and provision of living minimum wage for plantation sector workers, such as right to housing, guarantee right to housing, and livelihood. So I would like to conclude by saying that while we look at the macroeconomic changes that are happening at a national level, we need to also look at the grassroots. That's why we try to capture the pulse of the people in a very scientific way, and also try to relate to the formal government policies that are being adopted or that are being changed now, such as the Aswasuma program. It's a collective responsibility, and we as the civil society organizations which are represented here, and also more than 300 organizations that have been consulted and being part of this process, we want to be a part of the solution, and we will continue to cooperate with all the stakeholders to make sure that we have better governance in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, up next, I cordially invite Dr. Pakiasoti Sarvanamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives.
Good morning, everyone, members of civil society, members of parliament, excellencies. The governance diagnostic that we have presented, I want to emphasize the word governance with regard to it, because at the end of the day, we talk about an economic crisis and we talk about a political crisis, but you mold the two together and you come up with the question of governance. What we have in Sri Lanka is now the opportunity to forge a new social contract. That is what has collapsed. That is what is rotten to the core. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that issues of accountability and transparency, that we get rid of the corrosive cancer of impunity which has been eating away at the state institutions. We need to ensure that we have a clear notion of conflict of interest. We need to ensure that there is a difference between a state institution and a government institution. And that is a distinction that, unfortunately, in our contemporary lives, we haven't seen acknowledged. So what I want to suggest to you is this, is that, yes, this is a governance diagnostic that does, in the immediate sense, cover the period of the IMF agreement. But we have a much longer task, a much more challenging task. And I would suggest to you that maybe it'll take 10 years for us to get back to where we were when the crisis broke, and then 25 years to proceed from there onwards in order to be able to make up the deficit in terms of growth in the country. And I want to say to you, and this is something that may seem, well, somewhat hackneyed in a sense, but at the core of our governance crisis is the executive presidency. The executive presidency consolidates so much of power with very little accountability, if any at all. Therefore, it needs to be abolished. And I appeal to political parties as we approach a presidential election to come up with the abolition of the executive presidency as core to their political program, because I think it's always been the case, in my opinion, that the problem was with Parliament. A referendum in the country could always have been won on the abolition of the executive presidency. The issue was with Parliament. Also, I'd like to focus on the question of the Attorney General's office. We are talking about corruption. We are talking about taking cases, both in terms of what are now being called economic crimes, as well as the arguments with regard to allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, etc. The Attorney General is the chief advisor to the government, and the Attorney General is the chief prosecuting officer. There is surely an absolute conflict of interest as far as that's concerned, and therefore we need an office of a public prosecutor, and the Attorney General then can advise the government as far as legal defense or whatever is concerned. I mean, and the point here is surely the allegations are made largely against the government. How on earth then can the Attorney General provide information to the government and prosecute as well? So I think the abolition of the executive presidency and the creation of a public prosecutor's office, I think, is important. The third point that I want to make, of course, is that whilst there is a certain satisfaction that, look, there are no petrol queues and prices may well be coming down, etc., there is the lingering question of the tension between legality and legitimacy. The government is legal in that it went through the processes of appointing the president through parliament and all of that. But is it legitimate? And is not that the key at the end of the day to seeing any governance reforms through, because you have to carry the people along with you? That sensitivity, that empathy is what is at the core of democracy. It is about trust. It is about confidence. And if that is not there, we are probably risking, I'm not saying that it'll definitely be the case, but we're probably risking greater conflict into the future. So elections need to be held. At the present moment, we have the absurd situation of a president who has been voted in, who has been selected by parliament, a parliament which is, well, discredited by the public at large. We don't have provincial councils. The last provincial council election in the north and east, for example, was in 2013, 10 years ago. We don't have local government elections. And as a consequence, how do all of these things function to the extent that they do? They function through the office of the president. It's a total concentration and consolidation of power, you know. And with regard to the economic reforms that we're also suggesting, let me just give you one example. According to the constitution of this country, the president of this country appoints secretaries to ministries. And the secretary to the ministry is the chief financial officer responsible for the functioning of the ministry. We know, and I don't have to go into detail, of where these people have been appointed from. That needs to go. We need to have an independent public service as well. The specific acts that we have to engage in to clear up the problems with regard to the economic dimensions of governance are fine. But it is a longer term question of building trust and confidence in government and in governance. And those require deep structural reforms, which we have to commence. Otherwise, I think, as someone said, it's putting plaster on a wooden leg or whatever the aphorism is. So we need to commit ourselves to the immediate challenge of what the IMF reforms entail. But we have to recognize that we are rebuilding the social contract in this country, and that takes time. And it'll take, at least, in my opinion, a decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nishan Demel, the Executive Director of Verite Research.
Thank you. Nadishani Pereira, the head of Transparency International Sri Lanka, which has been the organization that has been at the heart of steering the process of producing this governance diagnostic. Fellow members of the core group of organizations that has been contributing enormously to steering and guiding the content in the report. Of course, that includes Professor Arjuna Parakrama, diligent members of the media who are here with us, and honored guests and friends. Thank you for your interest today in being part of what I think is a globally unprecedented action where civil society organizations across a nation have gotten together and said, in the midst of a debt and economic crisis, we want to pioneer and suggest, not just talking about the problem, but about the solutions that have to come from governance and government. I don't think that has happened before. So Sri Lankan civil society really has, I think in this case, distinguished itself. And this is not, as you can see from what Professor Parakrama shared, a litany of complaints or a list of problems. This is an impressive analysis and list of how concretely you can sustainably solve the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. The IMF has, for the first time, admitted, and the first time in Asia, said that the economic problems of Sri Lanka are not just rooted in the economic aspects of the country, but are rooted in the governance aspects of the country, and asked the government to produce a governance diagnostic. But, you know, there's a Sinhala kind of a phrase that says, Horage ammageng pena hanama wage. How do you ask the culprit to tell you, or the culprit's colleague to tell you how to find the culprit or how to solve the crime? So you don't ask the culprit how to solve the crime, and that's what the Sinhala phrase says. And I think a process led by the IMF and other organizations inevitably run into that problem, because they deal with the government. So they needed very much, I think, this initiative, which they have actually welcomed, that the civil society and the country must get up and speak about it. I'm going to ask two questions before I end my 5 minutes, one from the people of Sri Lanka and one from the IMF. But let me start this way. At the heart of what we called democracy is the idea that the political leaders who make decisions represent the people. And yet, people tend not to be too concerned about how decisions are being made when they don't understand how it impacts them. So colonizers that simply focused on extracting resources tended to be able to maintain colonial power for a very long time. But when they started taxing, their power got destabilized. And the famous phrase, no taxation without representation, was when people felt the pain of the decisions that are made, they become more alive to the problem of non-representation, and taxes are one way in which that happens. Arjuna started by talking about the Aragalaya, or the protests, the unprecedented protests in Sri Lanka, and talked about system change, that people asked for system change. What is the change in the system that they wanted? And I want to suggest that the heart of the call for system change is for the political and decision-making leadership, and it's not just political, also bureaucratic, to be accountable to the people for what it was doing. Now, I know, so here's my question to the people of Sri Lanka and civil society. I know that many of you and us or others go around saying, protesting the taxation and asking for the taxes to be reduced. And here's the question: shall we ask for lower taxes, or shall we ask for greater accountability on how those taxes are imposed and how they are spent? It is these taxes, I want to say, just like in that phrase, of no taxation without representation, that has, in a sense, woken up a society that was dulled to the abuse of power and bad decision making, because we reduced the governments that did it the most, reduced taxes the most. They simply borrowed unsustainably, and people thought, we are all right. It's okay, it's working, because we don't feel the pain, we just feel the benefits. But of course, as it comes home to roost, these are not sustainable ways of functioning and running an economy. You can't keep borrowing and spending. And today we are paying the price for that negligence, for that inattention, for that lack of interest in what government was doing. So we have a chance today with this governance diagnostic to rally around, and notice this is not saying reduce taxes. It is saying be more transparent about who you're taxing, what you're taxing, how you're spending it, and be more accountable. Accountability is the one word that is at the heart of this diagnostic, not accountability to human rights commissions abroad, but accountability to the people of Sri Lanka for how the economy is governed. And that's a very difficult thing we shouldn't put this problem at the feet of the IMF. The IMF, as a international bureaucracy, is accountable ultimately to the government of Sri Lanka, and hopes that the government is accountable to the people. But if the government that they are accountable to are not accountable to the people, the IMF has a problem being accountable to the people of Sri Lanka, despite the best intentions of their staff, who would really like to do certain things in a way that is more accountable to people. The organizational constraints make them actually a lot more accountable to government. And you will see the governance diagnostic that the IMF publishes, it'll be great to do a gap analysis. And what is here, because this is clearly the will of the people in Sri Lanka emerging, but it's not there, might be just the things that the government didn't want to see, or especially did not want to see, which the IMF has no ability to prevent from being omitted from their own governance diagnostic. The IMF also, because we are on the 17th program, it suggests that, either the patient is misbehaving very badly, or the hospital itself is perhaps, not providing sustainable remedies. So when you get to the 17th program, and 50% of Sri Lanka's, 50% of the years since 1966, Sri Lanka has been in the IMF program, 28 years in 56 years. We have to ask, what is it that the IMF tends to miss? They traditionally, understood that they must emphasize increase in revenue, but they didn't emphasize very much how you increase revenue, right? So it's important to say how much you raise, but how do you raise it? Who gets tax holidays? Whose taxes are not collected? And Sri Lanka has traditionally moved to a system where we respond to IMF programs by increasing the burden of consumption taxes and still going on with status quo, and in fact increasing tax holidays at the top and non-collection of taxes at the top while the bottom feels the pain. It is not simply about how much you should cut spending, but where you cut spending. The governance diagnostic shows that under IMF program pressures, the government cut agricultural spending the most, or a great deal, rather than wasteful spending, say, on assets like vehicles that are bought willy-nilly, even without an asset registration, asset management system being maintained for it. So I think we understand that governance has been the heart of Sri Lanka's economic problem, and the IMF has also, I think, understood it, and that's a very important shift that they have made. And in a way, the IMF has had the ability now to hold accountable a government that the people of Sri Lanka are struggling to hold accountable. And they have put very important clauses even in the program that is currently running. And it's surprising that while the government is implementing quite a lot of the actions that the IMF has asked, the actions that they are most prone to not implementing are the ones related to governance. And in fact, they are flouting the spirit of improved governance in the way they are implementing some of these actions. And I want to go into details, but I'll just end by reminding you of one governance action that the IMF has asked. They have asked for and that's mentioned in this, a fiscal transparency platform that does three things: that it should make transparent all significant public procurement contracts. It should make transparent a list of firms receiving tax exemptions. And it should make transparent a list of individuals as well as companies getting tax-exempt luxury vehicles. Remember, the staff level agreement was in place last September. It was negotiated even before that. The government has had over a year to do this. And yet it remains undone. The IMF is about to start the review to release the second tranche. And it has now the question, an extremely important decision to make. Do we really hold the government accountable to implementing these kinds of governance commitments? Or do we, with a nod and a wink and a shrug, perhaps say, oh, it's okay? The risk that the IMF takes is it risks losing credibility in terms of its own commitment and evaluation that governance is at the heart of the problem. And it risks giving government the signal that they can continue to get away by not taking governance seriously. So the question is to the IMF at that point. People of Sri Lanka are asking, but are unable now to get accountability from their government. The IMF is well placed and positioned. Will it make its governance, the commitments, will it treat them as being serious commitments or ones to be overlooked? Which creates an enormous moral hazard. So I think we all have important decisions to make. The people of Sri Lanka must ask whether we campaign and ask for lower taxes or greater accountability. The IMF must ask whether it will take its own governance commitments in the program, treat them seriously. And I think if we work together, we may still have a chance for the system change that we are all seeking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Up next, ladies and gentlemen, I cordially invite Upekshi Fernando, the program manager at Paffarel.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the combined and inclusive process that this diagnosis has been done. This is going beyond a scientific paper. It has been a people's diagnosis. So, having said that, I am going to focus on the recommendations which related to elections, which is number 15 and number 14, and touch upon number 16 as well. As Dr. Parakrama and Dr. Sara said, the elections are being postponed indefinitely. The local government elections and provincial council elections, more than several years. So why are we holding elections? Why the elections are in the top of people's key requests? Because we are a democracy. Because we are a representative democracy. So the way that we exercise our democracy is by electing our own representatives. So when we have no elections, that means we are robbing our public from that legitimate fundamental right. So that is why we have recommendation number 14 and 15, where we call for immediate elections, which are being postponed, that is local government and the provincial council elections. But it has to happen in a way that is acceptable to the people. So that's where the asset declaration and the campaign finance law come in. As you know, we do have a fresh campaign finance limitation law, which do not have a legitimate monitoring or execution mechanism in place. So that is where we call for more independence, financial independence, as well as more monetary independence for the Election Commission. Apart from that, recommendation number 15.2, we call for a election calendar where we have timely elections in place, and that right has to be ensured in the Constitution. Yes, so this has been going on, this campaign for elections has been going on for a while. And it has to be continuous. And it has to be said in platforms where the politicians cannot ignore. That is where the international community, as well as the INGOs and the esteemed MPs come in, where the people need elections, and the people's mandate has to be represented in all the governing bodies, from national into local government. Apart from that, the overall comment and the request is to form a implementation and the monitoring mechanism for these recommendations. How do we monitor this? This monitoring mechanism should be, as Professor Parakram said, it has to be a combination of civil society representatives. And the keywords, which I'm concluding my short remarks, the keyword should be, it should be whatever processes we implement, whatever recommendations we implement, it should be transparent, and these progresses and this monitoring has to be public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I now take this opportunity to invite Dr. Jehan Pereira, the Executive Director of the National Peace Council.
First of all, I'd like to thank those who organized this, Transparency and the other partner organizations, and Professor Arjuna who spent a lot of time and effort, writing this report and consulting us about it. I also like to thank all of you who are present here, especially those who are our elected representatives. I regret, however, that the government is not here. Maybe they're very busy. But this is a very important subject that we are discussing. This is the civil society view of how our country can get out of this morass that we are in, something that we never dreamt about when we were studying and growing up. We always thought our country was a fairly prosperous country, a good country, looking after all its people. And now we find that what we believed in is no longer true. I think in this, in our diagnostic, we will find two major themes. One, the theme of accountability, and going along with it, impunity, that our leaders can't be held to account. They can do whatever they want and they get away with it, especially when there are no elections. And the second theme, which I will be focusing on, is that of inclusion. Because I believe it is the problem of inclusion, or rather of exclusion, that created the conflict in our country, the ethnic conflict, the national conflict, right from the dawn of independence. However, we must also not forget that there are other problems of exclusion in our country. On two occasions, the youth, the underclass, the underprivileged, the rural youth rose in revolt in 1971 and 1988-89, because they were excluded from the table, from deciding on the direction this country was going to go in. Now, but I will focus on the issue of the ethnic conflict and reconciliation. And I want to start with the dawn of our history. What happened then? At the very dawn of history, of independence, 1948, a section of our people were excluded, were denied their citizenship rights. Today we are commemorating the 200th anniversary of those people who came to this country. At that time, it was 125 years. We know that when we go to foreign countries, now our people are going to foreign countries. They're going to try and get a better life for their children. And within 5 years, they are hoping to get the citizenship. Maybe they get it in 10 years. Here, these people were here for 125 years. And our leaders, our first leaders, decided that they were not going to be a part of our country. That was an act of exclusion, and there has been no accountability for that. No accountability, no reparation still, because those people living in the plantations are today, according to the World Bank statistics, the poorest in the country, where the poverty level is the highest, 50%. So one of the recommendations in this report is that the plantation economy should be restructured. Even now, they are getting 1,000 rupees a day for plucking the tea. That's not a living wage. But the plantation companies say they can't pay more because they are not making enough profit. Then something should be done. The plantation economy needs to be restructured, quite clear. And if you look at it, the smallholder section, which accounts for about 60% of the land, is producing 75% of the tea. So it shows that if this land can be restructured and given to those people to work on, maybe we will earn more, it will contribute to the dollars that we need. The second recommendation that we have in our report is about provincial councils, about devolution of power. Today, those are not burning issues in the polity, understandably so for the majority of people, because that's not such a problem. It's not a problem to them, but it is a problem to the country. Because until we share power, until we devolve power, share power, include the ethnic and religious minorities as decision makers in our country, we will not have true peace. We will not pull together as a united country. So I end with that, and also with the observation that, when you look at what happened in 1948 and the lack of accountability and transparency, and the fact that they went through the courts of law, I think the reason is that the masses of people also did not object to what happened then. So if we want our people to object, to protest, they have to be educated. They have to know what's going on. Today, another aspect of our exclusion is what's happening to the pension funds. They are being taxed in a way the corporate funds are not being taxed. And yet, there's nothing that can be done about it, because the people who should be at the table negotiating for them, for those pension funds, are not there. So we need to create an awareness among the general population for justice, both in terms of class exclusion and in terms of ethnic and religious exclusion. Because it is only then that those who lead our country will be responsive, and they're forced. And I thank the elected representative, Professor Pires, who's here, still with us, for being here, and all of you who I think will take the fight on as you must. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, the governance diagnostic report has been released, but it still remains that is not the only solution. The report being published isn't enough. What is the next step? What is the way forward? Ladies and gentlemen, to speak to you about that, I cordially invite onto the stage now the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International, Sankita Gunaratne.
Thank you very much. And very shortly, you will see a QR code being displayed on the screen, which will give you access to the full report that we've all been speaking so much about. So the purpose of today's launch and the purpose of this report has been to talk about the issue of governance in Sri Lanka with a wider scope than just to talk about the economic, and to have a particular focus on the issue of corruption. Now, we know from the uprising and the protests that happened last year that this has been a call of the people. This, of course, has been the call of the civil society for many years in Sri Lanka, but now we have come to a critical point where the problem of corruption can no longer be ignored. So this event today and this report has been an attempt to distill these calls into a tangible form, into a monitorable form, for lack of a better word, in a way that we can then evaluate as we go forward. And unfortunately, why we have come to this situation is because there has been a woeful lack of accountability in our governance to the people. And as Dr. Jahan said, we can no longer have the luxury and the privilege of sitting back and expecting our governance to be done for us. We have now had to really become active and engaged to demand this accountability because we no longer have that privilege. So, in going forward, we say to the government to please take account of these recommendations that have been made to you, and we stand ready as this civil society collective and larger civil society to assist you in this process, because it is not for us to just be detractors. It is not for us to only protest, only make our concerns known. We are also willing and able to engage in the solution. And we ask that that space be provided for civil society in order for us to be able to assist you, help you with it, and stand with it, stand with you, even as these recommendations are put into action. Now, of course, when we speak about that, there is a question of legitimacy. And the report has very clearly pointed out the need to stress test that legitimacy. Irrespective of what government gets elected, it is important that elections be held, that that question is asked, and that citizens answer in whatever way they see fit. So to the government, we say that this is also an opportunity to solve not only problems created by this government, but problems created successively over the years, structural problems that have lasted for decades and generations in Sri Lanka that need to be solved, that need to be addressed in that structural manner, just as the report has addressed it. Because we understand that no single person or no single individual or no single government can be held responsible for all of the country's ills. But still, we have to take responsibility for what we do with this moment for reform. It is a moment for reform that needs to not be squandered process. So within this opportunity, we ask for space, we ask for consultation, and we ask for legitimate, open, accountable action to be taken. And then to our development partners who have also come in to help the country in this critical moment, it is unfortunate that we need that assistance, but we do. And we have to recognize that they're a key part of this equation. So in being so, it is important that that role is taken very seriously, because even as you assist, and even as you have acknowledged that there needs to be a heightened attention to the problem of corruption, we should also recognize that the problem of corruption is not merely economic. Of course, its impact can often be economic, but the problem is a lot more foundational. We have been asking questions of whether Sri Lanka is, and raising the issue of whether Sri Lanka is really a captured state, whether our state no longer acts in the interests of the many, whether it only acts in the interests of the few. So it is really important as you engage that you not only not contribute to a disabling environment, but that you create an enabling environment. So you have to avoid the risk of enabling corruption through the assistance you're giving, and also to ensure that that assistance also is not re-corrupted, not subject to corruption one more time, because we recognize that these financial inflows are going into a system that is systemically corrupt in Sri Lanka. And it is also, as was alluded to before, this is also an opportunity that the rest of the world is watching, even as civil society engages, even as this is the first time governance diagnostic is being done by the IMF in Asia. There is a lot of precedent to be set here. So how that precedent is used is something that a lot of attention will be given to going forward. And also to the citizens of Sri Lanka, we say that, again, this is a moment not to switch off, not to sit back, but to be engaged. We don't get to sit back just because protests happened, just expecting the hard work to be done. Now is when the hard work of actual reform has to happen subsequent to the uprising. There still remains to be a lot of working out, a lot of consensus building, a lot of solution building, enforcement, and oversight that needs to take place. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sankita Gunaratne, Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International. Ladies and gentlemen, as all good things must come to an end, I cordially invite onto the stage the Advocacy and Research Manager at Transparency International Sri Lanka, Lasantika Hettiarachchi, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shalan. Let me just first start by saying that it's an honor to stand before you today to thank you for gracing this occasion, which marks a significant milestone in our journey towards more transparent and accountable governance. We gathered here today for the launch of the Civil Society Governance Diagnostic Report on Sri Lanka, a crucial document that sheds light on the state of governance of our nation. On behalf of Transparency International Sri Lanka, I would like to express a heartfelt appreciation to all the individuals and communities who shared their experiences and perspectives. Your collective efforts have made this report a reality. Making this launch possible today is a testament to the dedication of our researcher, none other than Professor Arjuna Parakrama, the Transparency International Sri Lanka team, Dr. Nishan Dimel and Verite Research team, and of course, the core group and their organizations, who worked tirelessly to compile this report in time. To the ever dedicated colleagues of mine of TISL, let me express my gratitude to you all. I want to also acknowledge the contributions of our external partners, consultants, stakeholders who have provided their valuable input, guidance, and feedback throughout this process. Your collaborative spirit and commitment to our shared goal have been instrumental in the success of this initiative. As we launch this governance diagnostic report today, let us remember that it's not just another document, but a roadmap for instrumental change. It contains insights and recommendations that are actionable and will guide us towards a more transparent, accountable, and efficient governance framework. While I also thank all our distinguished guests here today and everyone else who made this event possible, I would like to invite all of you to engage in meaningful discussions and dialogues following this launch. Let us now move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and determination in our collective pursuit of excellence in governance and a corruption-free Sri Lanka. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your patience. Thank you very much for participating in this event. Of course, this event or the content of this report will only see the light of day if the general public reads it, if the general public understands it, and if the content of this report is implemented, especially by the government, the state, and various other stakeholders that hold power in Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings a close to this event. Thank you very much once again for attending the event. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event, the civil societies that were involved in drafting and compiling the Civil Society Governance Diagnostic Report on Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, refreshments are ready outside for all participants today. However, I also request the members of the media to remain back as the press conference for this event will take place immediately after the close of event. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen, and have a great day ahead.
Check.
ලංකාවේ රාජ්‍යකරණ පිළිබඳ සිවිල් සමාජ විශ්ලේෂණ වාර්තාව එලි දක්වනවා. ඒක තීරණාත්මකයි. මොකද මේ ජාත්‍යන්තර මුල්‍ය අරමුදල විසින් දියත් කරන තියෙන අලුත් ගිවිසුම සම්බන්ධව රාජ්‍යකරණය පිළිබඳ වාර්තාවක් මුල් වතාවට ආසියාවේ ඉදිරිපත් වෙන්නේ මෙතනදී. ඒ ජාත්‍යන්තරයේ මුල්‍ය අරමුදල ඉදිරිපත් කරන වාර්තාවට කලින් ආයිට වෙනස් සිවිල් සමාජ සංවිධාන එකමුතුව තුළින් බිහිවුණු මේ රටේ පුරවැසියන් ඉදිරිපත් කරන අදහස් ප්‍රතිපත්ති තීරණ තීන්දු හා ඉදිරි දැක්ම මෙන්න මේ වාර්තාව ඉදිරිපත් වෙනවා. මේ වාර්තාවේ ක්‍රමවේදයට අනුව විද්වත් සාකච්ඡා 30කට වැඩි ප්‍රමාණයකුත් රට පුරා කරපු සමූහ සාකච්ඡා මාර්ගයෙන් මේ පුරවැසියන් එක් ප්‍රදේශ එක් වාර්ගිකත්ව ශේස්ත්‍ර තරාතිරම් නියෝජනය කරන පුරවැසියන් 250කට වැඩි සංඛ්‍යාවක් අපි යාපනයේ මඩකලපු අනුරාධපුර කුරුණෑගල රත්නපුර නුවරඑළිය අම්පාර මාතර නුවර යන ප්‍රදේශවලට ගිහින් දීර්ඝ සාකච්ඡා කළා. ඒ ලබාගත් දත්ත හා අත්දැකීම් අනුව තමයි මෙන්න මේ වාර්තාව පිළියෙල කරලා තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒක තීරණාත්මක වෙන ප්‍රධාන කාරණාව ඒකයි. මේක විද්වත් සමාජයත් මේ රටේ පුරවැසියනුත් ප්‍රකාශ කරන අදහස. බොහොම පැහැදිලි පණිවිඩයක් මේකෙන් එනවා. මේ රටේ පාලනය සම්බන්ධව ආණ්ඩුකරණය සම්බන්ධව ඉතාම වැදගත් තීරණාත්මක යෝජනා 34ක් මේකින් ඉදිරිපත් වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒ යෝජනා 34 අපි කොටස් 3කට බෙදීමෙන් තමයි ඒවා ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නේ. බොහොම තාර්කිකයි ඒක. කියන්නේ මුල් යෝජනා සමුදාය තියෙන්නේ දැනට පවතින රෙගුලාසි හා නීති වඩා විනිවිදභාවයෙන් වඩා වගවීමෙන් ඒවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කිරීම ඒවායි තියෙන ගැටලු නිරාකරණය කිරීම සම්බන්ධව කරන යෝජනා 18ක් තියෙනවා. මම හිතන්නේ ඒවා තුළ ඒවා අපිට ඕනනම් විස්තර කරන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි ඒව තුළ පැහැදිලි වෙන්නේ පොදු ජනතාවට සමාජයට මේ පැහැදිලි වන විදිහට රාජ්‍යකරණයේදී විනිවිදභාවය හා වගවීම තියෙන්න ඕන. උදාහරණයක් ඇටියට අපි බදු ක්‍රමය ගැන කතා කරද්දී මේකේ බදු අඩු කිරීම සම්බන්ධව නෙවෙයි අපි කියන්නේ බදු අය කිරීමේ ආයව වියදම් කිරීමේ ඒවායේ පාලනය කිරීමේ වඩා වගවීමක් විනිවිදභාවයක් අපි අපේක්ෂා කරනවා. නිසා ඔබ සැමම දන්නවා බදු අය කිරීමේදී ව්‍යතිරේක හා විශේෂ කොන්දේසි තියෙනවා. සමහර සංවිධාන ආයතන පුද්ගලයන් ඒ බදු ගෙවන්නේ නැහැ. ඒවා පිළිබඳ වාර්තා. ඊට පස්සේ අපි පැහැදිලිව ඉතින් බදු සම්බන්ධව බදු එකතු කිරීම ඒවා වියදම් කිරීම ඒවට වගවීම ඒ එක්තරා කොන්දේසි ගණත යෝජනා 13ක් පමණ තියෙනවා. ඒ සම්බන්ධව මේ ඊට වඩා තියෙනවා අපි ප්‍රසම්පාදනය පිළිබඳ ගැටලුව අපි දන්නවා. ඒක තුළින් තමයි මේ මහා පරිමාණයේ වංචා දූෂණ වගේ දේවල් මේ රටේ සිදුවෙන්නේ. ඒ විශේෂ තීරණ ගැනීමේ අයිතියක් කැබිනට් මණ්ඩලයට වගේ මේ විශේෂ ආයතනට ලබා දීලා පවතින ප්‍රසම්පාදන ක්‍රියාපටිපාටියවත් ඒව තුළින් ඇතිවෙන කොන්දේසි ටෙන්ඩර් වගේ දේවල් අවලංගු කරලා උල්ලංඝනය කරලා විශේෂ පස්ස දොරෙන් ගන්න මේ ගෙවිසුම් මේ වාසි ලබන එක නැවත්වීමේ කොන්දේසි යෝජනා අපේ තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තියෙනවා මෙන්න මේකේ දූෂණ වංචා අවම කිරීමේ පැහැදිලි යෝජනා තියෙනවා. ඊටත් අමතරව අපේ පැහැදිලි මේ තර්කයක් තමයි ප්‍රජාවෙන් එන විද්වත් සමාජයෙන් එන පොදුවේ මේ රටේ පවතින මේ තර්කයක් තමයි මෙවැනි විශාල වෙනසක් ඇතිකර මෙවැනි ගැටලුවක් මතු කිරීමේදී ඒවට විසඳුම් සෙවීමට මේ ආණ්ඩුව සුජාත ආණ්ඩුවක්ද කියන එක. නිසා සුජාතකරණය හා ඒකේ තියෙන අයිතිය තහවුරු කිරීමට අපි පැහැදිලිව කියනවා ඡන්ද පවත්විය යුතුයි කියලා. ඒ ඡන්ද පැවැත්විය යුත්තේ මේ දැනට ඒ පවතින රෙගුලාසි නීතිවලට අනුකූලව කල් නොදමා අවශ්‍ය වෙලාවට ඒ ඡන්ද ටික පවත්වන්න. Tamanට කැමති විදිහට කැමති ඡන්දයක් මුල් කරගෙන හෝ මේ අවාසි විදිහට ඡන්දයක් අතපසු කරන එක නෙවෙයි. ඡන්ද පැවැත්වීම අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි. ඒ වගේම අපේ යෝජනාවක් තියෙනවා මෙතන මැතිවරණ කොමිසමට මුල්‍ය වශයෙන් ස්වාධීන වීමේ ප්‍රතිපාදන තිබිය යුතුයි. නැත්නම් ඒ ප්‍රතිපාදන නොතිබුණා නම් ඒ තමන්ගේ කාර්යභාරය ඉෂ්ට කරන්න බෑ. ඒ වගේම ඡන්ද කාල සීමාව තුළ මුදල් වැය කිරීමේ නීති රීති ඒවා පැහැදිලි විනිවිදභාවයෙන් පේන ඒවා මුදල් භාවිතයේ සීමා කිරීම පිළිබඳ යෝජනාවක්ද තියෙනවා. එනිසා අපි පැහැදිලි කියන්නේ මෙන්න ඉතින් මුල්ම කොන්දේසි මංකුවක දැනට පවතන නීති රීති වලට අනුව වඩා විනිවිද වඩා වගවෙන ජනතාවට වගවෙන මේ යෝජනා මාලාවක් අපි ඉදිරිපත් කරනවා. දෙවෙනි එක තමයි ඒ නීති රීති ප්‍රමාණවත් නැත්තම් යහපාලනය පරිපාලනය පවිත්‍ර කිරීමට හෝ දූෂණ වංචා අවම කිරීමට ඒ නීති රීති ප්‍රමාණවත් නැත්නම් අපි කියනවා මේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති වෙනසක් ඇති කරන යම් මාලාවක් තියෙනවා. ඒකේ යෝජනා 12ක් විතර තියෙනවා. ඒ යෝජනා 12 තුල තමයි අපි කියන්නේ යම් දැන් උදාහරණයක් වශයෙන් ওই වියතිරේක බදු වියතිරේක වගේ දේවල් ඒවා වෙනස් කරන්න ඕනේ. වියතිරේක දීමේ මේ කොන්දේසි අපිට පෙන්වන්න. ඒක රට තියෙන වාසිය මොකක්ද? අවාසිය මොකක්ද? ඇයි මේ කොන්දේසි නිර්ණය කරලා තියෙන්නේ? ඒකේ මොකද්ද පදනම? ඒ වගේ යෝජනා තියෙනවා වඩා පවිත්‍ර කරන්න වංචා දූෂණ කිරීමේ අවකාශය අහිමි කරන්න තමන්ට හිතුමතේ තීන්දු ගැරීමේ අවකාශය අවම කරන්න. උදාහරණයක් වශයෙන් අපි යෝජනාවක් තියෙනවා කැබිනට් මණ්ඩලයේ තීන්දු තීරණ මේ ජනතාවට ප්‍රකාශ නිල වශයෙන් ප්‍රකාශ වෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒ ප්‍රකාශ වෙන්න ඕනේ ඒ තීරණය පසුබත තියෙන මේ කැබිනට් පත්‍රිකාව ඒකට හේතු ඒක යොදා ගන්න අනුගම ව්‍යවස්ථාවේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති මූල ධර්ම මොනවද කියන එක. මොකද කැබිනට් කියන එක කැබිනට් එක මේ පුරවැසියන්ට වග වෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කට්ටිය පැහැදිලිව දැනගන්න ඕනේ. දැන් අපි දන්නවා කැබිනට් ප්‍රකාශක හෝ කැබිනට් රැස්වීම් වලදී එයින් තෝරාගත් තීන්දුව විතරයි කරන්නේ. මේක කියන්නේ සියල්ලම කළ යුතුයි. විශේෂයෙන්ම මහා පරිමාණයේ ටෙන්ඩර් සම්බන්ධව මහා පරිමාණයේ ව්‍යාපෘති සම්බන්ධව තියෙන ගත තීරණ තුළ විශාල සැකයක් මතුවෙලා තියෙනවා. සාධාරණ තැකක් මතුවෙලා තියෙනවා. මේ මුදල් තුලින් මේ අපේ පුරවැසියන්ගේ බදු මුදල් හා වෙනත් මුදල් මේ අනිසි ලෙස පරිහරණය වෙනවා. කිසි වගවීමක් නැහැ. ඊට අමතරව අපේ යෝජනා තියෙනවා තුන්වෙනි කණ්ඩායම කියන්නේ මේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති වෙනසකුත් මදි නම් ප්‍රමාණවත් නැත්නම් අපිට ව්‍යුහාත්මක වෙනසක් අවශ්‍යයි. ඉතින් මුල් මේක පවතින නීති රීති මේ විනිවිදභාවය වැඩි කිරීම, දෙවෙනි එක තමයි මේ ප්‍රතිපත්තිය වෙනසක් ඇති කළා නීති රීති අඩුපාඩුවක් තියෙනවා නම් ඒව සංශෝධනය කිරීම, තුන තමයි ව්‍යුහාත්මක වෙනසක්. ඒ ව්‍යුහාත්මක වෙනසේ පැහැදිලිම එකක් තියෙනවා මේ රටට අහිමි වෙච්චා තියෙන මුදල් හොරා කාපු මුදල් ආපසු ලැබීමේ ක්‍රියාවලියක් අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි. මේ ලෝක බැංකුව හා ජාත්‍යන්තර මුල්‍ය අරමුදල වගේ සංවිධාන හරහා වෙනත් රටවල් වල එවැනි ක්‍රමයක් තියෙනවා. එවැනි ප්‍රතිපාදන තියෙනවා. එවැනි නීති රීති තියෙනවා. ඒ නීති රීති හරහා මේ රටෙත් මේ හොරා කාපු මුදල් අහිමි වෙච්ච මුදල් ඒ වංචා දූෂණ පිළිබඳ විනිවිද භාගය ඒ වෙනුවට ඒ මුදල් ආපහු ලැබීම අය දඬුවම් කිරීමේ මේ පැහැදිලි යෝජනාවක් තියෙනවා. එමෙන්ම අපි කියන මුදල් නාස්ති කිරීම පිළිබඳ ප්‍රශ්නකුත් තියෙනවා. දන්න උතුරු කරේ මේ හමුදාකරණය අවම කිරීමෙන් හා හමුදාව තුළ ඇතිවෙන ඒකන්ති අයිතීන් උල්ලංඝනය කිරීම වගේ දේවල් සම්බන්ධවත් අපේ මුල්ලියම් මට්ටමෙන් බලලා මේක නාස්තිය මුදල් නාස්තිය. ඇයි මේ තරම් ලොකු හමුදාවක් අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ කියන එක. මොකක්ද ඒකේ තියෙන පදනම? ඇයි උතුරු නැගෙනහිර ප්‍රදේශවල විතරක් තියෙන්නේ කියන එක අන්නේ වැනි ප්‍රශ්න. ඊළඟ අපි ප්‍රශ්නයක් මතු කරනවා මේ වතුකරේ තියෙන සාධාරණ ගැටලුව. මේ රටේ අවුරුදු 100කට පමණ කාලයක් තිස්සේ මේ රටේ විදේශ විනිමය හොයාගත් මේ රට මේ පොහොසත් කරපු ඒ ජන කොටසට දැන් ඇති වෙන පීඩන ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් අහිමි කිරීම විශේෂයෙන්ම නිවාස පිළිබඳ මූලික අයිතිය හා ස්ථිර රැකියාවක් හා සාධාරණ වේතනයක් ලබා ගැනීමේ අයිතිවාසිකම පිළිබඳව අපි මෙහි පෙනී ඉන්නවා. ඉතින් සමස්තයක් ඇටියට බැලුවම ඒ අපි කරපු ඒ යෝජනා 34 තුල මේ සමස්ත ලංකාවේ පවතින දූෂණ වංචා පිළිබඳ පැහැදිලි විශ්ලේෂණයක් කර ඒවායේ තියෙන ගැටලු මතු කිරීමෙන් පසුව ඒවා තුලින් ඒවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කරොත් ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම මේ රට වැටලා තියෙන ආඝාතයෙන් මේ ගොඩ ගැනීමට හැකියාවක් තිබේ. හැබැයි මේකේ ගැටලුවක් තියෙනවා. අපි මතු කරන ගැටලුවක් තමයි මෙම ආණ්ඩුවම තමයි ඔවැනි දූෂණ වංචා කරන්නේ. එවැනි දූෂණ වංචා ස්ථාපිත කර ව්‍යුහගත කරපු ආණ්ඩුවක් විසින් මෙන්න මේ වගේ ප්‍රතිඵලට විසඳුම් මේවා මේ කට්ටිය යුද්ධය මේ කට්ටිය නීතිය රහනට අසු කිරීමට හා මේ දනුවන් ලබා ගැනීම පරීක්ෂණ හරහා ලබා ගැනීමට ඇති හැකියාව මොකක්ද? ඒ නිසා තමයි මේ විද්වත් මේ වාර්තාවත් එක්කම මේක ජනතාවගෙනුත් අපි ඉල්ලන්නේ දිගින් දිගටම කරන්නේ මේක තුලින් කේවල් කිරීමක්, මේක තුලින් ජනතාව මැදිහත්වීමක්. අපි දන්නවා අරගලය තුල ඇතිවෙච්ච ඒ පිබිදීම් වගේ මෙන්න මේක අපි මේ අවස්ථාවක් කරන්න ඕනේ මේ ආණ්ඩුවෙන් බල කිරීමක් කරන්න. ආණ්ඩුවයි ඒ බලයේ තියෙන සියලුම අය විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවෙන් බල කිරීමක් අපි කරන්න ඕනේ මේවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න. ඒකට එක යෝජනාවක් තියෙනවා අපේ අර මං කිව්වේ ව්‍යුහාත්මක වෙනස මේ නීතිපති දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව අපි දකින විදියට ආණ්ඩුවේ රජයේවත් නෙවෙයි ආණ්ඩුවේ සේවාදායකෙක් බවට පත් වෙලා ඒ නිසා ඒක තුලින් දූෂණ වංචා වෙනුවෙන් පෙනී සිටීමට එතන සම්බන්ධතා අතුරු නැත්තම් බන්ධන ඇතින ගැටුමක් උතන තියෙනවා. එක පැත්තෙන් ආණ්ඩුවන්ට උපදේශන කරනවා, ආණ්ඩුව ආරක්ෂා කරනවා, අනිත් අතින් දූෂණ වංචා වෙනුවෙන් මේ නීතිය ඉදිරියේ ඒ දූෂිත කණ්ඩායම නීතිය ගේනවා. ඒ නිසා අපි කියන්නේ මේ නීතිපති දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවට බාහිරව අපිට අවශ්‍ය වෙනවා මේ වෙනම ඔය දූෂණ වංචා පිළිබඳ වැරදි පිළිබඳ මේ ඒකකයක් ආයතනයක් රටේ පිහිටවන්න ඕනේ. ඉතින් ඒක අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි. මෙන්න මම අවසානයේ ගත්තේ මේ වැදගත් කාරණාවක් කියන්න. ඒක තමයි අපි දකින විදියට අපේ මේ ප්‍රජාව දකින විදියට මේ රටේ අර්බුදය ආර්ථික අර්බුදය නිසා විශේෂයෙන්ම වඩාත්ම බර පැටවිලා තියෙන්නේ සාමාන්‍ය ජනතාවට, දුප්පත් ජනතාවට, කොංගුණු ජනතාවට මිසක් ඒ අර්බුදය පිහිටවපු ඒකට වගකිවයුතු පුද්ගලයන්ට කිසිම බරක් පැටවිලා නැහැ. ඉතින් ඒක ඒ අසාධාරණය අපිට පැහැදිලිව පෙනුණා. වරදක් නිසා මේ අනිසි පාලනයක් දූෂණ වංචා මහ පරිමාණයේ දූෂණ වංචා අපි කියන රාජ්‍ය අල්ලා ගැනීමේ පවා මට්ටමට ගිහින් තියෙන දූෂණ වංචා නිසා ඇතිවෙච්ච ගැටලුවකදී මිනිස්සු විඳින දුක අතරේදී ඒ අර්බුදය ගොඩ යන්නේ ඒ මිනිස්සුන්ගේ පිටින්. ඒ මිනිස්සුන්ට තමයි ඒ බර පටවන්නේ. මම හිතන්නේ ඒක ඊටාම ඛේදනීයයි. ඒකට අපි පැහැදිලිව මේ යෝජනා ඉදිරිපත් කරනවා ඒක වෙනස් කරන්න. ඒ වගේම අපිට තව කොන්දේසි දෙකකුත් තියෙන එකක් තමයි මේක ජාත්‍යන්තර මුල්‍ය අරමුදලේ විසින් කරන ලද ඉල්ලීම් හා බලපෑම් නිසා විතරක් කරන සංශෝධනයක් නම් ඒක සාර්ථක වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මොකද අපි දන්නවා මේ කරන යෝජනා කරන මේ රාජ්‍යකරණය පිළිබඳ මේ යෝජනා දිගු කාලීනයි. මේවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න මේ IMF එකේ අවුරුදු 2 3 4 කාල සීමාවට ඔබට යන්න ඕන. අවුරුදු 10ක් විතරට. ඒ නිසා රජයේ ආණ්ඩුවේ පුරවැසියන්ගේ සමස්ත මේ ලංකාවේ වගවීම හා කැපවීමක් තියෙන්න ඕනේ මෙන්න මේ සුළු කාල සීමාවෙන් ඔබට ගොස් මේව උපක්‍රමශීලීව IMF එක සතුරු කරන්න හෝ මේ වෙන විදිහේ හේතුවක් මත මේ සමහර නීති රීති ගැනීම නෙවෙයි. ඒවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න ඕනේ. එකක් තමයි අපි කාල සීමාව තේරුම් ගන්න ඕනේ. අනික තමයි අපි දන්නෝ යම් ප්‍රගතිශීලී සාධනීය නීතිමාලාව ගේන ගමන් අපි දන්නෝ ඒ පිටුපස තියෙනවා ඊටාම දුෂ්ට භයානක නීති ගෙනීමේ යෝජනා චෝදනා තියෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ රාජ්‍යනව සංවිධාන පාලනය කිරීම ත්‍රස්ත විරෝධී පනත වගේ දේවල් ඒවා තුළින් තාම භයානක තත්ත්වයකුත් තියෙනවා. අපිට තාම පැහැදිලිකමක් නැහැ මේ ආණ්ඩුවේ අරමුණ මොකක්ද කියන එක. හොඳම ඒවයි මේවයි ගැලපෙන්නේ නැහැ. නිකන් සීනි බෝල ටිකක් දීලා IMF එක සතුටු කරලා ඊට පස්සේ ආයි නැවත මේ අනිත් අතෙන් මර්ධනයක් දියත් කරනවාද කියන ප්‍රශ්න. මොකද අපි කියන්නේ සමාජයට අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි මූලික කොන්දේසියක් ඇටියට අවශ්‍යයි සිවිල් සමාජ ඉඩකඩ ඒ බලසතු වන අවකාශය ඒ ආරක්ෂක වටපිටාව අවශ්‍යයි. විසම්මුතිය ප්‍රකාශ කරන්න උද්ඝෝෂණ කරන්න තමගේ අදහස් ප්‍රකාශ කරන්න මූලික අයිතිවාසිකම් සියල්ලම ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න සාමකාමීව ඒ අයිතිවාසිකම් ඒ වටපිටාව නැතුව අපිට කිසිම විදිහකින් යෝජනා හරහා නීති රීති හරහා අපිට මේ අර්බුද සියල්ලෙන්ම ගොඩ යන්න බෑ. මේ ආර්ථික අර්බුදය මේ දේශපාලන අර්බුදය මතවාදී අර්බුදය සමාජ අර්බුදය එකට වෙල්ලා තියෙන එකේදී අපට කතා කිරීමේ භාෂණයේ මේ එකතු වීමේ විසම්මුතිය නිදහස අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි. නිසා අපි පෙනී සිටිනෝ ඒක වෙනුවෙන්. මේක තමයි මම කෙටියෙන් සමස්ත මේ විග්‍රහය කරා. ඊටාම කෙටියෙන් අතපසු වෙමින් ඇති. මම හිතන්නේ මේ විදත් සභාවේ අය ඒ අතපසු වෙමින් තියෙනවා නම් ඒව ගැන කතා කරයි. ඔව් ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා නම් අපෙන් දෙමළ භාෂාවෙන්
normally otherwise they get it translated.
yeah I think that.
Hash the තියෙනවද? Nishan, do you want to say anything? Enough. You want to say anything? No, I'm saying you. You said some very hard things.
So all of us except Arjuna.
He covered everything. And there
ප්‍රශ්න
are-
මොකද නැද්ද?
But there is this, we have like a podium, not podium, what do you call this photo booth there to give a voice cut. If you do it, we can use it on social media. In Sinhala, you can. Thank you. Yeah, and they do their own trans.